Hey there, my name is Ryan. In this video, we're going to do a review of Terraforming Mars, Ares Expedition. Now, before we get into the review, I'm going to do just a brief overview of how the game works. The review makes more sense. If you want a complete rules overview, there is a link for that in the description below. Or if you already know how to play the game, feel free to skip ahead using the chapters to the review. Now, the main goal of Terraforming Mars is to actually terraform Mars, which seems obvious maybe, but the game comes to this board here, which actually represents the three things you have to do to terraform Mars. One is the temperature. You're going to put a clear cube right here, and throughout the game, as you raise the temperature, you're going to track the temperature with this cube. Another cube goes here to track the oxygen level, gets all the way up to 14%, and now it's livable. And the third thing is the ocean. Now, right now, Mars is filled with lots of things that aren't ocean. Throughout the game, you'll be flipping these over and turning them into oceans. So each player will be doing their part to contribute to these tracks. Once every track is to the top and every single ocean tile is flipped, Mars is now terraformed and the game is over. The winning player is the one who contributed the most to terraforming Mars. Now you'll know who that player is because as the game goes along and players move up these tracks, they will move their score marker up one space here. Now how do we terraform Mars? The answer is with cards. Now what do all these cards do? There are three different types of cards. There are these green cards called production cards. They're called that because they produce something. This one here, if you played this card, every time someone does the production phase, you'll get 2 gold. We'll talk about that in a second. Here you get 4 heat. Here you get 3 gold. There are also blue cards. These provide you some ongoing benefit, like in this case, when you draw cards, you may keep an additional card. Or in this case, a special action which you will take in phase 3. Spend 2 gold, get a card. And the third type is red cards, and these give you immediate bonuses. Raise your victory points, 2 steps, flip an ocean, raise the temperature, something that happens right away. Now there are 5 phases in the round, but interestingly enough, you will not play all 5 phases every round. You will actually select, the players choose which round they want to play. So let's say in this case, one player said they wanted to play phase 1. They will secretly put out their phase 1 card, face down, and an opponent will also put down a card, face down. After everyone selected cards, you will flip the cards, and we will see that we are playing development phase, phase 1, and the construction phase, phase 2. Now, it could happen that both players play the number 2, in which case you will only play the number 2 phase 1s. Also, each of these phases have a bonus down here for the player who selected the phase. So it basically gives you a little incentive to say, if I play development, I get this bonus. If I play construction, I get that bonus. Very briefly, the phases are phase 1, development, which tells you can play a green card. Phase 2 is construction, which says you may play a blue or a red card. Phase 3 is action, which says you may take the actions on your blue card and also a set of standard actions, things like spending heat, plants, and money to raise these tracks. Phase 4, production, which means you may collect anything you have in this orange square here on your green card. And the 5th phase is draw new card. So it says draw 2 cards and keep 1. Let's real quick talk about a positive component in the game. So right here, everyone has this player board. This only is here to help you keep track of what all your cards say. So in this example earlier, if you had these 3 cards to say you get 3 money, 2 money, and 4 heat, you would have cubes to say every time production phase happens, I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 money, and I get 4 heat. And then later on, if someone plays the production phase, including yourself plays production, you get to produce what's in the orange. And what you do is you'll produce whatever number says here. They should always reflect what your cards say, and you'll just place them into these boxes. So in this example, 4 heat, we get 4 copper cubes, brown cubes here. And for the 5 money, we're going to put a silver, which represents 5. So after several rounds, you can have something like this. Tons of cards played in front of yourself. And then also different production over here. And after several production rounds, you could have a whole bunch of resources seen here. Money, heat, and plants. Now, without getting into all the details, as I said earlier, when someone does play an action card, you can take the actions on your blue cards, but also you'll do some standard actions like spend 8 heat, raise the temp to give you a victory point. All right, let's start out here with some things I think work really well. The engine building is really fun. Like, that's what this game is about. Like, you get all these cards, they're all unique, and you get to build your own engine. You kind of can choose a focus and go for that focus. One of the reasons this works so well is throughout the game, you're going to get tons of cards. It's not a game where they say, oh, here's 5 cards, now do whatever you want. And you think, well, I have plants, so I guess I'm doing plants. Or I have, lightning, I'll do lightning. This gives you like a lot of cards. You'll continually be drawing more cards for the game. You can always toss cards for money, so you'll be doing that fairly often. So you'll get a bunch of cards, you'll throw 3 away, you'll keep a couple. You'll do that fairly often in the game. Now we'll come back to components here in a second in another section, but for right now, as far as good things about the components, this is only about half the cards in the game, and they're hard to hold, and they are all unique. I'll also say about the cards, I know it might not be your favorite graphic design or art, but they're very clear. There's a lot of information on this game. They have to have these icons up here that are very unique. There's a cost, there's sometimes a temperature requirement, there's what it gives you, there's special words. There's a lot of different information that has to be on each card, and they lay it out fairly well. Once you get kind of the rhythm of how the cards read, it's actually pretty simple to understand and interpret. Another thing I think they did well in the game is it's not too long. Not saying I hate long games, but it is fairly complicated. And sometimes games are complicated just because they have to be super long, almost to stay on the table long enough. Now it's a long game. It's probably, depending on how fast you play, 1 to 2 hours. But something that's positive about it, it doesn't bloat at 3 or 4 players. It will take longer at 4 players than 3, but it won't be twice as long as 4 as it is 2. The reason for that is the game's over when the tracks are done. The game's over when you terraform Mars. So there's 4 players, there's more people terraforming Mars. There's also going to be more actions taken per round because it's a higher chance of 4 players that you'll be playing at least 3, maybe 4 different phases. Whereas 2 players, you might not play. You'll play 2 phases in a turn. Okay, so now let's get into something that I consider a flaw with the game. The biggest one for sure is this guy right here. For one, the little clear cubes they give you to track those things are just too big. They don't fit well. And there's no way to really guarantee they're not going to get bumped. That doesn't seem like a big deal. I know you're like, well, isn't that lots of games where you can bump this? It's so small. For comparison, here's just a card sitting on it. It's not that big of a board. It's small, it's in the middle of the board, and I didn't mention it earlier, but all players actually take their turns at the same time. Like when you're in phase 2, everyone just does phase 2. And you go to phase 3, everyone just does phase 3. So everyone jumps over, you're moving up your own personal score around the outside here, and if anything gets bumped, it gets messed up. Also in the center here is where all those ocean tiles go. Again, doesn't seem like a big deal, but the game wants you to flip them all out first, and then flip them over, whichever one you want, as you go around the game, just randomly. It doesn't really matter that they're random, but they're out here, and you flip one, and to get the center ones, you have to move the other ones out of the way, which you might have to move some tracks out of the way. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but if you do have 4 players all jumping in there and they can do it at the same time, well, I have 2 oceans, let me flip my 2 oceans, get my bonuses. Okay, I had to move the temperature up 1, and I've played some solo. I actually like this game solo quite a bit. I think I've played it 5 times solo, and I've had times where I don't know what track it's on. I look over and I'm like, oh, wait, was I 4% or I don't know. I really have no clue, so I kind of have to guess a little bit, which is kind of odd even in a solo game, and I'm trying to be pretty careful. So it definitely has that issue. Once it's bumped, it could be done for. Like there's not really a way to go back and add up points and say, well, I know I have this many or this many to done, because sometimes you're just spending resources to move oxygen up. So it's done. You have no way of going back and guaranteeing that you have the right amount of temperature or the right amount of oxygen on the track anymore. Now, some people would consider the graphic design or the artwork, I should say, well, actually both, a flaw. I'm fine with it. Maybe it's a little outdated. It is a little outdated, but it doesn't bother me. It just, you're in space, you're looking through a screen on the Mars, and you're trying to raise this up. It seems kind of spacey to me. The only other thing I can really think of that I would say is a flaw is a solo game issue. When you're playing solo, you will flip over a phase, and then you'll flip over a random one that the game has selected. It's just random from the 5. Now, after you flip the first one out, you know that they selected phase 1, let's say randomly, they can't flip out phase 1. So the solo mode only, they'll flip out another phase. You can flip out one. Well, if you ever cross over, just like normal game, you only get to play one of those phases. There's only an issue because in solo, there's a fixed number of turns you play. And there seems to me at least to be a wide range of difficulty between if you happen to flip over the same thing. Every 5 turns, you reshuffle their 5 phase cards, and it's happened to me before where you flip over a card randomly, and you had selected that card. You're like, well, that stinks. Well, now it's time to select another card. Well, you can't select a card, you just select that crossed over, so you select one of the other 4 cards, and then you flip over a random card, and you crossed over again. Well, you've effectively lost, like, 2 phases. Maybe a little too much randomness just in the flip. I wish there was some way to mitigate that. Like especially that first one, you flip it over and you can't help it. Then once you see it, you're like, now there's a 1 in 4 chance this could happen. Then you flip it over, you're like, yep. So now I'm going to talk about a few things that I like. I just personal preference things. They're not necessarily things that are definitely good about the game. They're not things that I think everyone has to like, but just some perspective for me to hopefully give you a clear picture on whether you also like the game. The first one's just engine building is fun. I just really like any game that lets you do something, and then as you play these cards, you'll get more and more powerful and more powerful. It's one of these explosion games where you do the first round, maybe you took, let's say you're playing a 2-player game, you did 2 things. Like, okay, and you have no money. So the second round, you draw some cards, you toss a lot of cards, you do a second thing. So now, okay, I got 2 cards in front of me, or 3 cards. And then you play the third phase or third round. The times like, okay, I have like 3 or 4 cards now. And somewhere around that 3rd, 4th, or 5th round, it's just explodes. And you have a turn where you're like, okay, well, I'm going to raise the temperature 3 times and play this card, which gives me immediate bonus to flipping an ocean, which gives me a bonus thing here. It just can get crazy really fast, which I like in games. I like kind of this. It's a long-term strategy game where you're like, okay, how can I in 4 turns do this? So I think the engine building in this game is really, really good. Kind of on the same line, because there are a lot of good decisions with that, there are tons of cards. So the game has a pretty high replayability. I played 5 solo games of this, and also multiplayer, but also the 5 solo games I played in particular, they felt different every time. When you play a game, you always discard cards face down, so you don't really know what's out there, what's been played, but the replayability is pretty high on this. Theme is really fun. I like the theme of this game. It seems petty or not important, but to me it is. You actually get to terraform Mars. You're like, well, that's obvious, right? Not really. There's lots of games where like we're building a cathedral, and the player who wins is the person who, gets the most points before turn 5. One last preference things I like is it's pretty complicated. I don't have to play complicated games to be happy, but it makes you think more long term than lots of games do. The cards bring a unique challenge where sometimes you have 10 cards in your hand. And yes, interpreting them is the first step. Once you can interpret what they all mean, you think, okay, which of these cards work well in combination? Which ones can I dump now? There is that, I should put this in things I don't like, but I'll say it now. There is that first time through the deck feeling. The first time you play this game, you won't get through all the cards, but there is that like, oh, this gives me 3 plants. Is that good? I don't know. Like, so you'll get used to that, but eventually that becomes like a positive about the game because there's so many different ways you can go. As you can probably tell by now, I like the game. But here are 3 things preference-wise, not counting the components and the solo play issue I mentioned earlier, but 3 things that I don't think are great. I think the phase decisions, I want to play phase 2 or 3 or 4. I don't want to cross over because if I cross over at 4, we'll cancel each other. I think that's a little too overplayed. Yeah, if you play 4, you'll cancel the 4, but everyone at the table is playing 4. So, if you don't cross over and you play 2 and they play 4, you get to do 2 and they get to do a 4. The second thing is minor. I feel like, and I'd say it's minor because I haven't played the game enough to know. I feel like money's kind of the obvious choice. Money's good. If you have money, you can buy better cards. So I feel like it has a clear choice. If you have a money card, especially one that gives you 2 or 3 production phase, you probably should play it early on. Now the last thing is the biggest one for me. I'd say this one for last as far as the negative preference things is there's a fairly low amount of player interaction. As you probably know, I like player interaction. Not that I like war games necessarily. I really like Euros actually. But I like it to matter what my opponent's doing. And it does in this game to a certain degree. Like, oh, they have a lot of heat production, especially if you're playing a 4-player game. If 2 players have really gone for raising the temperature of Mars, you probably shouldn't be the 3rd person to do this. You should probably go for a different strategy. But fairly low amount of player interaction. You can take your turns actually simultaneously because it doesn't matter. There's like friendly things in there. Like if someone does max out a track, but you're in the same phase, you can max it out too. So fairly low on the player interaction. So personal recommendation, I like it. I think it's a good game. I think it's pretty clean for being as complicated as it is. And I'm not saying it's the most complicated game that's ever existed, but the gameplay is fairly clean. The biggest things I would kind of throw out there to be cautious of, if you're kind of on the fence with this, is interpreting the cards is a big hurdle. If you're not used to seeing all these unique cards and your hand could be 10 things and you're trying to decide what they mean and what that means strategically. Like, let's say this is your first game you play. It's kind of like more complicated. I bring this up partially because this game's available at Target. It's kind of like out there as more of like a mass market game. Mass market's not the right word, but you know what I mean. It's available. Someone could just walk by Target and say, "Oh, cool, that looks fun." They could be in for a lot. Like, hey, draw 5 more cards. It's like, okay, what do these 5 cards mean with these 12 symbols? So that would be that one caution. Now that's what I think maybe makes it appeal so much to gamers. We're like, cool, there's so many things out here. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy it because of that. Just be okay with every turn, especially when you draw cards, just taking some time to interpret. Maybe a few gameplays that you need to play with open hands. I've done that before where you say, hey, like I have this. Everyone just looks around and sees what everyone has. The game, again, is fairly not direct interaction, so it doesn't ruin the game to do that. Right along that same note, it's a little prone to AP. So if you have analysis paralysis or your group has a lot of analysis paralysis and you don't want to play a 2 to 3 hour game, might not be the game for you. You could really count out lots of turns and say, okay, in 3 turns, I want to have at least 8 plants because I want to raise the oxygen one. So I need to do this. And if someone's slower at math, but they really want to analyze everything, it could make for a long gameplay. I think if you're someone who doesn't mind the complexity, you're excited about the complexity, or you don't mind kind of getting there and figuring it out, it's good for you. If you're someone who is into medium weight board games already, this is great. Just make sure the low component quality as far as that main player board doesn't throw you off too much, or if you don't like the art, the design. But as long as those things are good, I think you'd be like me and say, wow, it's a fun game. It's a pretty fascinating game to play through and kind of like see how it changes every single time. Last thing I'll mention is it's very available right now. It's about $40. I saw it on Amazon for $33. I wish I got sponsored for saying that, but that's a pretty good deal. Or find a board game store in the 40s. That's a good deal. There's a lot of games for 40. And you kind of, if I just like look at this game, so I took it out of the box and showed me all the different cubes. They showed me that all these cards, well, I don't know how many there are, 100 something. They're all unique, and the level of gameplay and complexity goes into it. These player boards, even though the main board stinks, the player boards themselves are really cool with like, they actually hold your cubes in place and everything. I would guess this game would be a lot more expensive. So I would say if you like medium games and you're considering this, it's a pretty good value. Alright, that's my thoughts on Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition. If you have any questions, or if you just want to comment on your thoughts on the game, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. I'll see you next time.